There was a article released in the Financial Times that alleges something that would be kind of scary. And that's not to say that the war has been scary already. That is to say that this is a avenue of the war, or at least Putin's view of the war, that is not talked about in depth, and what conclusions we could take from that, which we haven't. We haven't gone down this train of thought, either here on the channel or I think generalistically in society. That leaves us with some pretty bad case, and I would even say worst case scenarios. And what I'm talking about is a scenario where Vladimir Putin, where all this calculation of what is making him continue the war, what motivated him to go into the war. Well, I think the motivations of why he invaded are pretty clear. You can read his essay that he released before he invaded. He talked about the view of Ukraine as an extension of Russia itself, on top of, the dialogue about NATO expansionism, which got much more coverage. There was very little, at least media focus on Russian revanchism, chauvinism, and this idea of empire, which he thinks is kind of crucial to Russian identity. And as somebody who hyper focuses on that Russian history, hyper focuses on that empire, I can look and I can see his motivations, I think, pretty clearly. But just because you can see as to why somebody invaded, that doesn't necessarily explain the motivations as for why the war is continuing at this point. Because somebody could accept the sunk cost fallacy. Somebody could accept everything that Putin has said about the war that is true and right when it comes to its interests in Russia and why they should engage in the war. Of course, I disagree with that, but you can believe that and still say it's cost too much. It's cost too much lives. It's taken too long. It's cost literally too much, as in it's eating up more and more of the state budget. Russia has eliminated essentially its savings. It is now taking on debt. It has had to raise the VAT tax, which is a burden on Russian consumers. And you could point to any of these things and say, okay, it's too much. Let's cut our losses and go. And the hope was, both for Ukrainian military planners, United States diplomats in the Biden administration and in the Trump administration, as well as other European capitals, was that at some point this cost-benefit calculation would cause the Russians to come to the table and find a compromise. While there's been a lot of pontification about the ultimate goal of the West being Russia's collapse, many Western leaders are really terrified of Russian collapse. They're terrified of the idea of the largest nuclear state on the planet not being able to have proper control of its atomic warheads, and what that type of chaos across across the Eurasian continent could mean for Asia, what it could mean for Europe, what it could mean for the Middle East and the Caucasus, what it could mean for that atomic arsenal. What does it mean? What does it mean for our security outside of any basic humanitarian concern that somebody might have of the situation? There's a question about our security, or the security of any of these nation states that are going to be worried about those warheads ending up in the wrong hands. And so while they might like the idea of a capital in Moscow that's more sympathetic towards Western concerns, they have been scared of the idea of a Russian collapse. So the idea was, through Russia's self-preservation, they would stop before they got to that point. One element of the calculus that this is reliant on, though, is that the decision makers at the top, those in the Kremlin, behind the walls of the Kremlin, meaning the literal physical walls of the Kremlin, they know what they're doing. Not only do they know what they're doing, but that they're getting good information. But this reporting from the Financial Times seems to suggest one of the scarier theories, the idea that Putin simply does not understand what's going on, doesn't know what's going on, is being misled by his generals, could lead to him dragging the war out longer than it necessarily has to. That's not to say the war had to happen in the first place, but even from Putin's worldview, somebody can understand when the cost has become too big, it's become too large, it's just too much to bear. But if you can't make that calculation, if you can't read the numbers because the numbers are being fixed, well, then you won't be able to know when to pull the brake. Let me read you the opening few paragraphs from the article released by the Financial Times earlier this month. Colonel General Sergei Kuzelev, a large gray-haired man in his late 50s, told Russian President Vladimir Putin in late November that his troops had completed the liberation of Kupiansk, a small but strategically important town in Ukraine's Kharkiv region. So you finished everything, Putin double-checked as he visited the command post of a military grouping led by Kuzylev. Affirmative. The city is under our control, Kuzylev replied. Putin later awarded him the Gold Star Medal, Russia's highest military honor. Just 3 days after the ceremony, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky posted a video of himself standing in front of a boundary marker at the entrance to Kupiansk. I went to Kupiansk myself to show the world that Putin is lying, he said. Independent assessments say Russia has not fully controlled the town since early 2022. Now, the situation in Kupiansk for the Ukrainians was difficult in the last few months. And anybody who was concerned about the Ukrainian defense in Kharkiv was paying close attention to the fact that the Russians had been able to get into Kupiansk, and not only into the city itself, but into the city center itself. And the question was becoming whether or not the Ukrainians would be able to mount a defense in Kupiansk, or whether they were going to cut their losses, pull everything across the Oskol River, and try to reposition their defenses. Problems emerge for the Russians logistically by continually having to support offensive operations over the Oskol River, where a lot of their troops and a lot of their supplies were being targeted by Ukrainian drones. It was also difficult that they were going directly from the north straight down. And since there were Ukrainian positions on both sides of the river, that meant the Russians advancing south into the city took fire from both sides of the river. And so that meant pressure from both sides of the river. And it also meant that the Russian advance was supported from only one path. And if that path was cut off, well, fuck. And for the Russians in Kupiansk, well, fuck, it was cut off. And the Russians left in Kupiansk were slowly getting essentially smoked out. The ones that remained after they were cut off. And Zelensky posted that video talking about Ukraine's military achievement. Now, this is just to say that it's not like the Russian high command just imagined that they had taken Kupiansk, and then, therefore, all Zelensky had to do was take that video. There was a military effort to take Kupiansk, but they had simply not achieved the goals that had been set out. And anytime you look at Russian military achievements, it's never as simple as, and this is if everything's going good, the way it should work is we have objective A that should be committed by this time, by this date. And then we go from objective A to objective B at this time, at this date, right? And that's how you go through a plan, a multiple offensive plan, where you take this town to that town, and you take a tactical win, you turn it into a strategic win. But often when you look at Russian military planning in this war, it's, okay, Pokrovsk is just one example. We'll just use Pokrovsk. Okay, we're going to push the Ukrainians out of Pokrovsk by Thanksgiving, by mid-November. Okay, well, that didn't work. So we're going to push the Ukrainians out of Pokrovsk by mid-December. Well, that didn't work. Now we're going to see if the Russians are going to be pushing the Ukrainians out of Pokrovsk by the end of January. And these dates keep getting pushed back and back and back. But these pronouncements on dates that they're supposed to capture it, or prospective dreams of what they're supposed to do, this is coming from somewhere. This is coming from high command. This is coming from Putin. This is coming from the political body that's supposed to control the military body. But they keep overshooting to keep the man upstairs, not God, Putin, to keep the man up the stairs of the Kremlin happy, to keep their jobs in place, and to keep their influence abundant. And Vladimir Putin, wanting to continue to get these positive results, wanting to be able to see through his nationalist vision, it's easier for him to believe these things than have to completely restructure a military where he has deep loyalty concerns. We'll get back to that in a second. More from this. Putin has pressed on with the war effort despite seemingly favorable peace terms offered by Donald Trump, a decision that Western officials believe has been influenced by the flawed information reaching the Kremlin. One thing that we heard often on the campaign trail here, and this is how Donald Trump slightly was beating Harris when it came to polling on the Russia-Ukraine issue during the election. And that problem was that we just go over to the Russians, we negotiate, and then we end the war. That was the plan. That was the counterance. We said that there was a war. It was too difficult and too complex to solve just by talking to the Russians. The Russians would not accept conversation in that way, that they were not willing to see compromise yet. And we had to create the conditions to make them see compromise. And the counterance to that, the problem with that view was that they simply disagreed, that the solution was to talk to the Russians. Now, the logic that underpinned this sometimes I think was Western centric. For example, I remember listening to Tucker Carlson talking to Steve Witkoff, who would be Donald Trump's top negotiator on the issue. And Tucker at one point said, why would the Russians want more of Ukraine over all of Ukraine? It costs them so much. I wouldn't was the direct words used, as if his predilections for what he cares about and what he wants as a non-Russian who was not born anywhere near that side of the world is a good reflection upon what the Russians want. That your interests for what you see in the war is different for their interests and what they see. Of course it's different, because they came from a different part of the world with different interests. But that was not enough. They had to go through 11 months of talking with the Russians to find out for themselves. Not only is it a problem of what they value versus what we value, it's not that everybody in the world simply just values all of the same things. It's also a problem that they don't know how bad it is, or they are willing to accept how bad it is. Probably a combination of both. Where the United States obviously would not accept the type of casualty numbers the Russians are putting out there. But also, I don't think Vladimir Putin is the first person to necessarily hear about every casualty report. And I think all those things together, plus Vladimir Putin's fervor and his age, an old man, not like he can just wait another 10 years to try again, is pushing him forward and pushing the war forward in a way that if it was different leadership under a different paradigm, maybe it wouldn't. Russia's military and security services give Putin regular updates that inflate Ukraine's casualty numbers, stress the country's resource advantages, and play down tactical failures, according to two officials to the Financial Times. Though Putin also regularly meets with confidants who explain to him how the war has become a growing drag on Moscow's sputtering economy, the rosy picture painted in the military briefings has nonetheless led to him to believe he can win the war outright. Mind you, when we say win the war outright, we're talking about in his purview. We're talking about going past Kramatorsk to taking Zaporizhia and Kherson, taking all of the territories that they've announced they've annexed, and more. So when we talk about winning the war outright, it's not what you think would be winning. It's what I think would be winning, looking at it like a video game player. Like, this is a point on a grid and this is a point on a grid. That's different than what he sees as victory from his view as a Russian chauvinist, his view as a hardcore revanchist. J.D. Vance alluded to this dynamic, the dynamic about them believing that they can win the war outright, when the U.S. vice president spoke of, and I quote, a fundamental misalignment of expectations, where the Russians tend to think that they're doing better on the battlefield than they actually are. Vance said that has made a deal with the Russians harder to reach. So J.D. Vance has publicly expressed that when talking to the Russians, their view of the battlefield, their view of where the economy is, their view of where the war is different than the American view. And so I think that part of the reason why you'll see so much pressure applied on the Ukrainian side is it's cheaper to pressure somebody on your side than it is to put in the investment necessary to pressure them. But I think they also might not know how to pressure a government who they think, from their determination, it's not as simple as looking at the results on the battlefield, because if you look at the results on the battlefield, well, if Putin's misled about the battlefield, that might not change negotiation that significantly. So is it worth the investment, or would it be easier to make the Ukrainians give up something that might be unpopular, might be immoral, and might be contrary even to national security, but it would probably be easier, at least in their purview, to try to force them to do it. Because what are they going to do without the United States? Before they find out that some governments might be in a political position where they cannot just come out and announce, we're going to do whatever you want, which is what the American government found out about the Ukrainians, both due to the Ukrainian constitutional model and the fact you can't just rewrite all the territorial boundaries through the executive branch. It's not that simple. But also just due to the presidency completely misjudging the temper on the ground. Yes, people want to see the war over, but that doesn't mean a war over at any cost. And that has been something that's been difficult for them to comprehend. Difficult for Steve Witkoff to comprehend, and difficult for the administration to comprehend. And the emphasis on things like elections, which will not turn the Ukrainian public against the government when it comes to territorial concessions or anything that the government has thought about pressuring the Ukrainians off of, or have even attempted to pressure the Ukrainians off of. That's not going to shift that. It's not going to change that. If anything, it's just going to continue to undermine how our government looks in relation to those positions, but it can't shift the Ukrainian position off of it because it's just too unpopular to force 100,000 people out of their homes on top of abandoning the territory for the people who have already been pushed out of their homes. It's just too unpopular, especially after a decade of fighting for this territory where defenses have been put up. But it was easier to make that demand of the Ukrainians than to make a demand of a government that, even if you got the pressure points, even if you got all the pieces in place, you don't even know if they're going to be able to understand the situation they're in. Maybe the clear-eyed nature of the Ukrainian government in comparison to the Russian government, at least from JD Vance and our government's point of view, might actually be a detriment. Being deluded, being lost in the sauce, not knowing what the situation actually is, might reinforce someone's negotiating position, especially when you're dealing with a government like the Trump administration that cares less necessarily about getting the foundation to be as strong as possible for this peace than to just get the peace through the door, which has seemed to be a priority. Putin has received 6 briefings in public about the front line since October, the most since the war began, according to independent Russian news site Daily. At 3 of them, he appeared in military uniform. At a 4.5-hour press-a-thon on Friday, Putin again insisted that Russia has the upper hand. Our troops are advancing along the whole front line. The enemy is retreating, he said, assuring Russians they would witness new successes on the battlefield by the end of the year. Asked about Zelensky's video, Putin said it had been filmed a kilometer away from the town and claimed Ukraine did not control any part of it, referencing Kupiansk. Why are you standing on the doorstep? Go inside the house, right? If they control Kupiansk, the whole sky is covered in our and Ukrainian drones like flies. You can't just go ahead closer to the town. It's got to be so weird to be like, yeah, Zelensky's at the gate of that city that's under drone control and where, cars on that road have been hit, but like, go into it if you're so it just, in comparison to the amount of hyper fear that Putin seems to project when he travels across the country, this constant fear of assassination, constant fear of being struck, staying far away from the front line. It is weird to see him be like, why don't you just go inside Kupiansk? Yeah, Zelensky's not in Kupiansk because the city center isn't completely controlled. There's still Russians there. He was there just to show that he could be there and to bring attention to the fact that the Russians were cut off from Kupiansk. If you go to Kupiansk now and you look at the map, or you look at any of the mapping softwares that are public and credible, you can see that while there might still be some Russians in the city center, they're essentially hiding underground and they're slowly getting flushed out one by one. This would essentially be cope by the Russian president in order to try to downplay the fact that they have failed in achieving what he said they achieved just a week prior, because they had been cut off after a counterattack, which worked. And to say cut off, counterattack, failure on this, to acknowledge any of these things when you're going 4 years on for this war is to send a signal of this war might last a lot longer than the public would want it to, there could be a lot more cost than the public would like it to have, and that there could still continuously be more and more setbacks. If the message that Putin's trying to put forward is our troops are advancing along the whole front line, to announce your retreat is to say, oh, that's never mind, that's not true. And so simply, instead of acknowledging the fact that, yes, the Ukrainians launched a counteroffensive, but, it cost them too much and eventually we'll take it anyway, it's instead just been a game of denial, hoping that since they can control the major communication networks, both the very large Telegram channels that are associated with the military and the mainstream TV shows, they can just either deny it or change the subject. In August of 2024, Gerasimov told Putin that Russia had halted Ukrainian advances in the Kursk region, even as Ukrainian troops had already seized parts of the territory, triggering chaotic evacuations that cost some civilians their lives. The gap between triumphalist reports, including repeated claims of capturing the same settlements, and the reality on the ground also made Gerasimov and Shoigu prime targets of Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin's aborted mutiny in 2023. So some of you might have forgotten about the Thunder Run just because, how quick the stories around this war seem to update. But for those of you who might have forgotten about the legendary Thunder Run, for months, the better part of a year, Yevgeny Prigozhin was publicly complaining about a lack of munitions being diverted over to Wagner and his boys, which were made up of a lot of convict soldiers. That means people who were recruited from the prison systems, as well as private mercenaries from Africa and Syria.